in the early stages. And to begin with, that very much looked at installing solar. We worked with a load of social housing organisations that installed considerable amounts of solar. We then looked at EV and started to look at heat pumps. And I think the challenge, and I talked to Ed, so I now work with the Ombudsman independently, having sat on their board for a while. The challenge you have with consumers is there are a lot of unseen pieces to the puzzle. And when you think about installing an EV charger, especially if it's got time of day charging on it and it automatically starts to charge your car at certain times of day and not at other points, what is very difficult to tell is how do you tell whether you're getting a good value for money for that? How do you tell whether the EV charging company is actually taking more money out of that? And at the moment, it's not transparent and it's very difficult to see. So the early stage people are kind of happy to sort of bowl into that because they feel perhaps that they understand it better or they know it better. But I think you then get to, so that's a very small part of the market, maybe 5 to 10% of the market. You then move to the rest of the market who just don't trust things, which is fair enough. And so they then, if something is hidden or they can't understand it, then that is when you start to need to figure out, well, how do you get transparency into that area? So early adopters tend to be more trustworthy because they trust themselves, but the rest of the market less so. And I think in terms of energy suppliers, and you touched on generators, I think what we haven't done enough in this market is get the generators and that part of the market involved in thinking about consumers. Because we run quite an inefficient system. We've gone from a system that used to support 30 power stations in the UK. And basically, the way you used to do dispatch was somebody used to give somebody a call on Monday morning and say, we need a bit more power, it's Monday morning. It was called Monday morning-itis in the industry because power prices quite often go up because somebody was a bit sleepy on the other end. So that's how we used to run a power system. Now, if you think about it, we've gone from 30 to over 1 million generators, some of them very small, putting power going the other way. And we've got a centralised system that's still trying to catch up, figuring out how to manage that. And what we should be really doing is, and it's really interesting, the industry splits into two. So when I joined, a lot of the leaders of energy companies back then were all engineers, love engineers. They don't really think about customers. And when they used to talk about the industry, they used to talk about customers as meters. And what went on the other side of the meter, they didn't really care about because all their job was to get it down the wires to the meter. And so there's been this transition over the last 20 years, and I agree with Amanda that we've seen energy suppliers become much more customer focused. But what we haven't done is necessarily taken the rest of the industry on that journey. And my challenge to the rest of the industry is how does the rest of the industry start to bring down consumer prices? And therefore, I think you will build more trust for consumers if, one, you can look at prices, and then you need to look at, okay, so when we have these really interesting deals, so you can get an EV tariff or time of day tariff, how do we make sure that those tariffs are doing what they say they are doing on the tin? And how does the Ombudsman help that going forwards? I met recently with Ofgem to chat about this, and they are going to have to get their heads around the fact that today they tend to regulate sort of 6, 7 large players, and suddenly they're going to have to go to lots of small players because this is going to be an absolute transition for the whole industry. So we've really got to think about that through a consumer lens and what is going to be important. Trusting the price is going to be important. So we should be looking at how do we reduce costs, like smart metering. My personal view is we should absolutely review smart metering today. 5 billion of cost, I reckon, going into that programme. We should start to remove that and just roll out smart metering in a very simple way. We should be looking at, actually renewable levies are coming off in the next 5 years. So we're going to see a reduction in bill of £100. We need to be talking about that so people recognise that that's actually an improvement coming through. We need to be looking at, so some of the small and medium-sized enterprises still stuck on contracts from the Ukraine time. So they're still on, if they signed 4-year deals under pressure from brokers, and they're still on those, you remember those ridiculously high prices. So they're still trying to cope with that. We need to be looking at that today. And my final piece is that we need to look at how do we rebalance the way that we charge on electricity prices. So today, all the energy efficiency costs go on the electricity bill. But most people heat their homes with gas. So we're reducing the gas bill. So we've gone from 2,900 average usage in gas to 2,700. Why are we reducing the gas bill but paying for it through electric? So we really, this is, we've been talking about this, but we really need to grapple with those challenges, is making sure you put the right things in the right places on the bill. And then when we have a conversation with a customer, and you talk about how do we transition, and they look at the price of electricity being super expensive, they're also going to go, well, why should I move to an electricity heating system if we've got the most the highest electric prices in Europe? So there are various levels of trust we need to work on, and they're not all big policy changes. Some of them are deep down in the weeds, but we need to get in there and start changing them.
Thank you. So why is it that we do have the highest electricity prices in Europe? I mean, you've seen on the right of the political spectrum, certainly in Reform, now with the Conservatives announcing that they want to scrap the Climate Change Act, growing scepticism that actually a lot of the green levies, as it were, are pushing up the costs and making the system more expensive. Is that right? Is that what's driving it?
So I think there are various things that are driving it. You've got to look at it in context as well. So we have some of the lowest gas bills in Europe. So we have the biggest differential between our electricity and gas retail bills. And that is because all our policy costs end up on our electricity bills and not on our gas bills. So I think when we talk about that headline, I get that it sounds like a good headline, but you've got to balance it with what 80% of households in the UK are on mains gas, and therefore, if you look at that balance, it's in a very different place. So we need to think about that first: is how are those two balanced? And then you've got to think about, well, what are the costs that are coming off? As I said, we're going to lose £100 per customer from, I think, the renewable obligation. The feed-in tariff is going to start to taper off over the next 5 years. So that will automatically drop. And then we've got to think about what's going to be happening to wholesale prices in that time. So renewables beginning to... when we talk about wholesale prices, this might get a bit techie now, but I'll do it very quickly and we can move on if you want to. But nearly 90% of power is contracted on long-term contracts. It's not bought in the short-term wholesale market, although prices are set around that. And as you see more alternatives coming with, whether it's nuclear or renewables, you will see that start to affect long-term power prices, and that will start to come through in the energy costs.
There is some assumption, I have heard the argument, that wholesale gas prices, which of course affect electricity prices, will come down quite considerably towards the end of this decade because of such strong production of liquefied natural gas in, say, US and Qatar, which is interesting, and what that means for the market. Anyway, let's move to Ed. And I'm sorry to hear about your arm.
That's okay. Quite an interesting story, actually, which is not entirely irrelevant. So I was riding an electric motorbike 3 weeks ago, and I could probably see where this is heading. So I guess I'm walking proof today that the transition to electrification can be rather challenging. But yes, so thank you for bearing with me. I'll give a few thoughts from an Ombudsman perspective. Great. So I guess thinking around consumer protection, just I guess a couple of thoughts from me and what we see, and then maybe some thoughts about how we might move forward around protection. From a regulatory perspective, we've obviously got very established regulation. Ofgem's been in place for a long time, and this might sound strange, but it's actually quite narrow in terms of its scope. Regulation was set up to regulate the gas and electricity coming into people's houses. The energy market is very different. Juliet's just touched on a few examples there. But despite being quite narrow in scope, it's incredibly complex. And I think Ofgem would be the first to admit that. It's complex for industry. It's complex for consumers. Amanda mentioned her dad. The typical consumer, I think, struggles to understand how and why they pay for what they do on their energy bill. And in that context, protection becomes very important because you can't necessarily expect consumers to make good decisions in a very complex but essential market. And I think the other observation I'd have in terms of protections is that the further you diverge away from those core services, the fewer protections there are. So if you have the audacity to buy your energy through a broker, you're less protected today. If you happen to live in a house that has a heat network, you're less protected. we worked with Amanda and her team when she was in office around closing some of these gaps, like for small businesses, which was fantastic, and we're really pleased to see that come in. But as you venture further off into the different types of technologies and services related to the transition, protections fall away, and I think that's something for us to really reflect on at a time we're going to expect consumers to make really big decisions about what to invest in and how to use their energy. So, going forwards, I think there's still some immediate gaps that we need to close in terms of protections, things like heat networks, which I've mentioned, things like brokers. We absolutely support Ofgem's intention to simplify what's there. I think it is incredibly complex. We also reflect on our own service there. It is still too difficult for a consumer. I'm very glad you managed, Ryan, but it is still very difficult for a consumer to have the wherewithal and the knowledge to bring a complaint to us. We know that the majority of consumers who could use our service don't, and we're obviously thinking very carefully about how we make it easier for people. Because what happens with our service is, if a supplier hasn't been able to resolve your complaint, the ball's then thrown back to the consumer and gone, well, you go and fix it, you go to the Ombudsman. Actually, we don't think that's right, and it could be a lot easier and quicker and simpler for consumers. And then final point for now is, I think, and this ties into what Juliet said, I think whatever protections and regulations we put in place have got to be flexible. They've got to be able to adapt quickly. We shouldn't be redesigning the wheel every time a new technology or a new service offering comes along. And that's a real challenge. I certainly don't have an answer to it, but as we look to try and simplify what's there, I think we should also look at how we make sure it's applicable to new technologies which we may or may not be aware of now.
Great, thank you, Ed. I think there's been an argument from you that you guys should be put on a statutory footing. Is that right? And how would that help in terms of consumer protection?
Yes, so just to explain this very briefly, when we decide that a supplier has done something wrong, the supplier is obliged to put it right. But that doesn't have any legal basis or legal route of enforcement. So we find that in just under 10% of cases, suppliers take too long to implement those remedies. The argument is, with a stronger legal footing, suppliers would be more incentivised to do what's right first time in a quick way. So it's not a panacea, it's not going to solve all problems, but I think increasing the weight of our decisions and our ability to enforce with a small e is a good thing, because the consumers who reach this position have been waiting so long for what is often a very simple fix. So not a panacea, but I think it has some merit to it. Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about, the typical profile of somebody who goes through your process, because I can imagine, like me, sharp-elbowed, middle class, I want this energy provider to, fix what's happened. And actually, it's the more vulnerable, low-income consumers actually who would do better in terms of getting redress and protection. So who are the typical people going through the Ombudsman, and how can we make sure that more vulnerable customers come into it?
You are absolutely right in that characterisation. It tends to be the sort of person you'd expect. So, one of the categories, for example, higher levels of education are very closely linked to the propensity to come to us. And, again, put yourself in that position. You've waited at least 8 weeks for your supplier to resolve a complaint. You're fed up with the process. The last thing you want to do is go to a new organisation that you've never heard of and you don't know what they do. I think that what people think an ombudsman is varies significantly, but I think it's perceived as a quite legalistic, stuffy process, inaccessible probably. So you're absolutely right. We need to make it easier for people to come to us, and in particular for those groups who might be less likely to do so.
Great, thank you, Ed. Let's zoom out a bit now and go to Rachel to kind of understand where the public are in terms of their views of the energy market, and in particular this sort of move to more greener heating, the idea that you've got to put in heat pumps or other technologies. What are the public thinking about this stuff?
Thank you. So I guess I'm from Ipsos, so we work in the public affairs area, work on energy and environment. And so what I'm going to talk about is from some of our public polling, from evaluations of government programmes, from work with people like the Climate Change Committee, government departments and Ofgem. So I guess the first thing to say is, in terms of the energy market, the biggest concern for consumers is still prices. So in earlier this year, we did some polling across the country, 88% concerned about their energy prices. That's the same proportion as back in 2021. And obviously, even though may not see that peak that we saw in 2022-23, prices are still 40% higher than they were before then. And with the sort of volatility of the energy market, recently a House of Commons research briefing last month actually said the only way to sort of guarantee reduction in heating prices is through increasing the energy efficiency of our properties. And then when we think about, so the public's concerned about price, public's generally supportive, generally concerned about climate change. That has reduced a little bit, so from 85% in 2021 were concerned about climate change. That's reduced to, let me get my stats right, 77% earlier this year. And there's also been a reduction in the percentage of people who think that they should act. But it's still a majority. So most people are concerned about their bills. Most people are concerned about climate change. And we do know from some polling we did last year that in terms of which net zero policies would be most supported by the public, actually additional support to improve the energy efficiency of buildings is very much number one. So we've got high concern about bills, high support for climate change, but that's not reflected in terms of uptake of low carbon solutions. Obviously there's been quite an increase over the last year, but there's still concern. And the big things that are affecting uptake are finances, understanding and trust. So from a survey we did a year or so ago, 3 big issues affecting the public's understanding that affects take-up of heat pumps. Don't understand how they work, don't understand their benefits in terms of environment or efficiency, and there's also a sort of believe true gap in that the public tends to, generalising of course, think that things like improving their own energy efficiency, sort of smaller installations have more of an impact than actually big things like heat pump or renewable energy. For low income, and interesting you just brought that up before, low income and vulnerable groups, these issues are heightened. So we've been doing some work with Energy Systems Catapult on inclusive smart solutions. Talking to low income and vulnerable people last year, 45% had not heard of heat pumps or had absolutely no idea what they were, and a third of them struggle to understand information about new energy efficiency products. Distrust of energy companies, I'm afraid, is still a big issue. They're up there with politicians in terms of trust. And research with low-income and vulnerable consumers actually found they'd be more likely to trust organisations they're familiar with. So if it was housing associations, for example, that was promoting low carbon solutions, that would be more effective than energy companies. But cost is still a big issue. So cost has been consistently been highlighted by the public as a key barrier, even after trust and awareness barriers have been addressed, at least to some degree. And so in some net zero citizens panel we ran last summer, the participants were emphatic that the upfront cost of purchasing and installing a heat pump were the key barrier for them, followed by trusting the skills of installers and maintainers, concerns about cowboy installers, and also their effectiveness. And just moving on to increased consumer protection, evidence strongly suggests that more focus on consumer protection could help address key barriers to uptake. And again, looking at our work with low-income and vulnerable consumers, there were 3 critical consumer protection needs identified. Firstly, safeguards to prevent low-income and vulnerable consumers from being incentivised to suppress energy consumption in harmful ways, so actually going without heating or eating, going out without hot water. Protection to ensure essential devices like medical equipment are not closed down, should there be any flexibility events or automated shutdowns. And finally, and this is a really important one, that companies clearly explain how promised benefits are calculated using realistic baselines. So not looking at the average, and also, I'm also a trustee for the Centre for Sustainable Energy, and one of the reasons I'm particularly keen on them is because they talk about nobody should have a cold home. They don't talk about everybody should turn their heating down. a lot of people have illnesses where they can't be in a cold home. And so I think this thing about looking at, telling people to use less energy, they're already using the absolute minimum that they can. And then finally, just to go on to a few sort of what changes are needed. So, as ever, clear information, clear phase-out dates for gas boilers, standards, providing grants and loans. Ensuring affordability is absolutely key. Public's very keen to have to live more sustainable lives as long as it's as cheap as what they're doing now. Nobody's going to pay more unless they're very environmentally invested and have the luxury of that additional income. And finally, I think building trust is a really key priority, and actually word of mouth. Word of mouth is the one thing that works. Most people don't know someone who's got a heat pump. My sister's got one, so I'm constantly talking about the benefits. But most people don't know, and I'll just tell you one very quick anecdote. I was actually on a work call about heat pumps, and the guy came to maintain our gas boiler. And my husband said to him, so what do you think about heat pumps? And this bloke was like, hey, not in my lifetime. And I was actually at an event like this about a year ago, and somebody said, if you just gave every person who goes out maintaining boilers a heat pump in their own homes, you could fix the problem.
Very interesting. And also very interesting what you said about housing associations being more trusted in terms of advice around low carbon installations. And I think there is a social housing retrofitting fund, I think, which housing associations can access, which can help tenants. One thing I was going to ask was, I don't know if you've ever looked at differences in attitudes between different energy companies and which energy companies do well and why that is, or is it just all of them stink?
We haven't, I'm afraid.
Right.
We just know that everybody loves Martin Lewis.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Right. Let's move to policy. So, how can these things be fixed? So, Kieran, very interested in your views on, how can we lower prices? How can we get more people to install low carbon technologies? What are the interesting policies that you've heard about?
Well, I mean, let me start. I think it's quite useful, especially as a representative of The Guardian, to come here and kind of do a bit of explanation about what I heard last week at Labour conference, and just say, what we're picking up from the government on this. There were 2 or 3 conversations I had that were quite, I think, revealing for me during that week. One was with a member of the cabinet whom I had lunch with, and he said to me, we only have 2 priorities now. One is the NHS and one is cost of living. I said, what about immigration? What about climate change, etc., etc.? I said, no. Immigration was an interesting one because they actually thought that would go down in salience if the government was able to tackle the cost of living. So given that, I said, well, what does that mean? And this person said, well, we are going to essentially try and pass every policy through a filter of what does this do to inflation. Now, that's all very well saying in the context of a lunch with a journalist, but it's quite difficult because there's quite a lot of things that the government is doing that would actually be inflationary, including on energy. I then had a conversation with somebody working in the policy unit who works on energy issues in Downing Street. And I said, what do you spend most of your time doing? What do you look at? And this person said, most of my time is spent thinking about pricing. I said, but all we hear really from Desmos is how you're going to manage the transition and how you're going to, do the next phase of the, solar panel rollout or, offshore wind farm leasing arrangements. What exactly are you going to do on pricing? And there were a couple of things that came up that I thought were really going to be very interesting debates. I'll talk about low carbon heating in a second. One of which, and this is a little bit techie, but one of which is how exactly the next few rounds of renewables are procured by the government. Ed Miliband's plan is to do them, particularly with offshore wind, in huge auction rounds. And the reason for doing that is just to make sure that things are on the grid in time to hit the government's decarbonisation targets for decarbonising the electricity grid, which are very ambitious. What I was told was that is not going to be a great thing for prices, because if you say to everybody, if you say to all the suppliers, we only have one auction round and we need a lot, they're going to unsurprisingly jack up the prices because they know that you are essentially quite desperate as the procurer. So there's kind of techie debates being had at the moment about things like that, about whether policies like that could be tweaked. But of course, each of those then has a knock-on effect for the speed of the transition. One of the interesting things on low carbon heating is that it is an area of real, I would say, discomfort for the government. And one reason for that is it's not a party political thing. This faced every government. But unlike most things, like, say, installing solar panels, installing a heat pump is not actually cost effective. Even over a 10-year horizon, you don't make your money back. It's a very high upfront cost. It's not like installing a few solar panels on your roof. And despite all the government subsidy schemes, it is still not cost effective. And I think, when we're talking about polling people on heat pumps, we need to admit that people are not wrong here. They are correct when they say that this is a pricey thing to do. So what can the government do to tackle that? Well, part of it is more incentives, but as we've heard already, where does the money for that come from? Government finances are very stretched. Does that go onto people's energy bills? Maybe as Juliet says, we need to think about gas bills a little bit more. What about things like, district heat networks? Well, there's all sorts of reasons with British housing why that's very, very difficult to do. The best answer that I heard is we need to have an incentive, not for people to necessarily replace their gas boilers at the end while they're still kind of working, but as they come to the end of their lives. Just don't try and force them on people, which I think is a real question of trust, but just really sell them when people are automatically coming to a time to renew their domestic heating. But I think it is just an open question. Are we going to push ahead with low carbon heating because we know that we need to hit our net zero targets, but we also know it's going to cost. At some point in the road, it is going to cost. I think it's very interesting the UK lags behind, both in terms of stocks and new sales, not just the Nordic countries, not just Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, but even Italy, Portugal and Spain. And I suspect the reason for that is actually the hotter countries are using them as air conditioners as well. And I wonder as well whether then part of the answer is to sell these not just as heat pumps, but as almost air conditioning pumps. And as our summers get hotter, you could do both, And if people are starting to install those kind of little in-room air conditioners where you stick a hose pipe out the window, which is very expensive to run and people hate the aesthetics of them, maybe selling them heat pumps as an answer to that question as well could be part of that. But I think, fundamentally, the government's really struggling with this question right now. And whereas there are answers, I think, that you can provide on a lot of electricity questions, the question about low carbon heating is a much more difficult one to solve financially.
Very interesting, and very interesting intelligence from where the Labour government is in terms of their thinking. Interesting what you said about using natural kind of trigger points to enable people to make the transition to, say, heat pumps, end of life of a boiler. Some people talk about moving house as quite a useful trigger, and they say, well, can you incentivise that more by having stamp duty reductions or making mortgage, having a mortgage and getting a mortgage basically dependent on whether there's a certain level of energy efficiency, which would be, quite tough and interventionist. But do you think that's a sensible thing as well, thinking of that as a trigger point?
Yes, I think it is sensible. There's two things I would say about that. One is the government's already doing some stuff in this area anyway. There's an announcement today from MHCLG about, if everybody remembers home information packs from the last Labour government, they didn't go down brilliantly, but, trying to get more information out there, things like standard searches, information about any chains that you're in, information about the quality of the structure of a house, before a sale process is initiated. Perhaps, obviously EPC information is in there, but maybe we could get more information about what is the what is the heating supply there, and what money could you save by changing that, and here are some incentives to do that. There's one just risk, I would say, there as well, which is that we thought that things like that would really help with solar panels. So one of the major incentives that the government puts out for people to put domestic solar panels on their roofs is, well, you'll improve the resale value of your home because energy bills will come down, and then anybody coming in doesn't have to face the upfront cost of that, but they'll have much lower energy bills. In fact, the opposite happened, because people, especially on older houses, people didn't like the look of solar panels. So we just have to be very careful about how we sell this stuff to make sure that we're not, we might think, oh, this is a great idea, don't worry, you've got a hot heat pump. But if the consumer hears, oh no, I've got something I don't really understand that might break down, and we're just hearing from Rachel about the concerns about cowboy builders, what on earth, I know what a boiler is, but I'm not sure what this thing is over here. You do have to be quite careful about that stuff.
Great, good stuff. Let's open it up to the floor. So if you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. And wait for a microphone because, we can hear you, but the people watching on the live stream need to be able to hear your question. So we'll start here with Sarah, who's always here for our Fringe event. Good for you. Loyal.
So I live and breathe this and sleep it. I'm Sarah Costance Winterton. I work for the non-combustible insulation industry, MEMA, but also chair the Energy Efficiency Infrastructure Group, which represents the supply chain in this area. This is something we have obviously been living and breathing. There are two specific solutions. We like to be solutions-based here. First of all, I'll just briefly talk about a warm home stamp duty. We call it rebate to renovate. Please take a look at our calculator. It shows the impact of putting insulation in or heat pumps into your home. And it looks good, and it's for consumers and everything, so they can actually see. So we have that trigger point when people buy and sell their homes to obviously ensure that they can make those changes. They know what it costs. It's a little bit of a tweak up and down. It fits really well with low-income families as well. Those are the bottom end of the scale. So this is something we've been advocating for a long time. So a shameless plug. On the other side of it, consumer trust and confidence is really key to us as an industry. One bad install, one bad news story is catastrophic. We don't want it to happen. So we've looked at this in a different way. Although I'm from the insulation industry, we actually look at this slightly tech agnostic and actually think whatever goes into our homes needs to be working, and those consumers are getting what it says on the tin. They're getting those lower carbon emissions, they're getting those lower bills, and we know lower bills are absolutely crucial right now. So we've looked at this, and it's all about meter measuring and monitoring, and those installers, those companies that are going in, are actually guaranteeing for those consumers that they're going to get those outcomes. And I think that's the only thing that will obviously, on top of obviously education and people having access to that will actually ensure that consumers start to build that confidence. We're still obviously a long way off, but also trigger the kind of what we call the able to pay market, the mass market, which will also help bring costs down on installs, etc. So we're looking at this in a different way, flipping it on its head. It's not about just driving heat pumps. It's not about just driving insulation. It's about the thing together. We're looking at this holistically. Unfortunately, government policy at this stage is far off that.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Right, we're going to go to some more questions. We'll have a round of questions. So this gentleman here in the blue shirt.
Hello, I'm Frankie from Fair by Design. We're a charity and we focus on the poverty premium. So that's any example where someone in poverty spends more on a household good or service. We see that a lot in energy. The points on trust, I think, were really important. We have a lived experience advisory panel, and they still really don't trust energy markets, and they don't really want to be kind of involved in them either. And one thing we call for is a social tariff, which would take some of that away. And I just wanted to wonder what the panel thought about the idea of having an energy social tariff.
Great, thank you. And then this gentleman here.
Hi, Stu Horn from the Energy Saving Trust. I also chair a board of companies, group of companies called the Heat and Buildings Business Council, which is all about putting forward policies that will help accelerate the heat transition. And I was really interested in the panel's views about what would boost customer confidence. Because I heard quite a lot from Juliet about the need to communicate about the differences coming on energy prices. But I'd be keen to hear about what other people think will really cut through and help boost confidence. A couple of observations on what's been said that are related. When somebody's boiler breaks down is probably the worst time to be talking to somebody about installing a heat pump. In our experience, you need to be talking to people well ahead. So there's a real need to engage people ahead of their boiler breaking down. But at the point where the boiler has come to the end of a lifetime, to be having that sort of very deep and informative conversation. And the second thing is that in our experience, impartial advice just really helps to have that rich conversation with people. So we run the advice services, Energy Saving Trust runs the advice services in Scotland and Wales. We've seen the run rate of installation of heat pumps historically be about twice as high in Scotland as it is in England. Part of that is due to the availability of impartial advice before and after installation to help people feel really confident about it being the right move for them, and also making the most of the technology when it's in their home.
Great. Any final questions? Because I think this will be the sort of final round. Will, and just to say, if you're watching from wherever you are, a beach or whatever, and you want to ask a question, do so through Slido, and then my team will pass on the question to me. So, but Will.
Will from Bright Blue. Sorry, this is the Australian question. I just want to pick up from Kieran's point and see what the rest of the panel's thoughts were. Like, is Britain backing the wrong type of heat pump? Because I mean, most countries do have like reverse cycle air conditioners. You know, they can be very effective at heating their homes. I know the government consultation is underway. Have we backed the wrong horse on this one?
Great, thank you. Okay, so we will end with those 4 points. So I'm going to ask each of the panellists to pick up on 1 or 2 of those. So what I will do is start with Juliet.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to pick up on the question that Stuart came up with related to customer and the heat transition. And I'll tell a story of when I first, so a while ago, I installed a battery, probably about 10 years ago when the batteries were first coming out. They installed a battery and they were going to basically use it to bid into capacity market with the grid. And I asked the company, could I have the data? And they said, no, it's our data, not your data. So my view on a lot of these new technologies is we actually have to work out who owns the data. And my personal view is it is the customer's data. Because coming back to the point around how do we prove, so if somebody comes and guarantees to me that it's going to produce this much and I'm going to make this much money or save this much money, which is in the PV and the heat pump market, then I need to know that I can get hold of that data to prove it. And I think we need to have a bigger question around who owns the data, and then how do you use people like Ombudsman Services to come in and then support you on analysing that data? Because quite often getting hold of the data, I know from working with businesses, not just individual consumers, trying to get hold of energy data can be very hard, particularly if you've had a broker in the middle of it. So data, I think, is an absolute key part for me. And then the question on the reverse, the multi-technology, I absolutely think we should be looking at the two technologies. And the reason being is that we see, I mean, heat-related deaths are higher, I understand, in the UK than cold-related deaths, and roughly, I think so. And I think we're going to see that increasing. So actually, from a health point of view, I think we should be considering cooling, particularly in certain areas of the UK.
Yeah, great. Ed?
I think I wanted to pick up on the confidence point that was raised, and also Sarah's point about, you know, it only takes one bad install to really colour consumer confidence. There's lots of examples of this in energy. I think if we think back to the prepayment meter, stuff that happened a couple of years ago, it only takes 1 or 2 stories in the eyes of consumers, I think, to really undermine technology in this space. And I think one of the really important things, you know, we're never going to stop mistakes happening or get rid of all of the bad rogue traders, but I think what consumers want to see is that when we spot something going wrong, we take action quickly and effectively to put it right. It's difficult today because of the difference in sort of regulation and protection across different technologies, which I talked about before. You know, we get complaints from consumers who haven't been able to achieve the savings on things like solar panels that they were hoping for, and they're complaining about their energy supplier. And the energy supplier, quite fairly, is coming back saying, we didn't put them on, we didn't make that promise to the consumer. That's really confusing for a consumer, and it looks like there's nobody there to help them. So I think for me, and I think I'm certainly quite risk averse as a person looking at investments in my household. I think probably people at large are quite risk averse when it comes to these big decisions. I think we can really help them by being clear about what happens when things go wrong. Because today it's a very complicated picture and it's not clear to people, I think, who you do go to when something happens.
Yeah, I think that's right. Amanda.
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, on heat pumps, I think it is definitely challenging, exactly like you were saying, actually, Kieran, about the timing and the cost, and I'm not quite sure how we really tackle that. And I think there's a real appetite that to do it when you don't need a new heat pump, even though it will pay benefits in 10 years' time. It's really hard to sell that. I would absolutely agree with that. And I'd written down before you mentioned air conditioning. I think that's a real opportunity for us because we're certainly getting warmer. I just want to come back though on things like the social tariff and how we afford, how we really tackle the affordability, because obviously there were loads of conversations around that. And it's incredibly complex, and one of the things that we were working through at the time, and obviously we then had a change of government, and I assume this is probably being continued, is how to solve the affordability problem, because it is alarmingly complex. It's the way that the bills are made up for a start. That is a really important thing. The debt is absolutely immense because the suppliers actually hold on to that debt and then they charge that out, and it's a fact. And how you get around that, I'm not quite sure. We looked at using things like the priority list, but of course the priority list are not necessarily people who are vulnerable from a financial point of view. They are vulnerable people, but not necessarily financial, so that wouldn't necessarily solve the problem. And also, and this is just a fact, thinking about where you would get data to support people. There's no consensus across government departments either. So unfortunately, you have one system that could be run by DWP, you have another system that could be run by the NHS. So if you're looking for where to hit that affordability, it starts to get incredibly complex. But just to come right to the point, there is one person. It's just like you were saying, Rachel, about Martin Lewis seems to do it quite well. And it is absolutely true. And we actually had regular meetings, I have to say, with Martin Lewis, meeting the citizens' advice to find out what we could be doing, talking to stakeholders from suppliers. But somehow, if we could capture that, I don't know how he does it so well, but people trust him. He goes into their front room and they trust what he's saying.
Great. I'm going to come to Kieran. What Sarah's point about this stamp duty rebate, does it sound good?
Yeah, I mean, I speak for the Chancellor here. Right, oh, there you go. I'm sure she'd like it. The last I heard, she was considering completely scrapping stamp duty and replacing it with something entirely
yes,
different.
I did see those before. I think that's very unlikely.
I think that is hugely unlikely. Yeah, I mean, at the moment, Treasury thinking is all about how can we plug this enormous fiscal gap, and then I think once you get over this particular budget, then maybe she'll start thinking about solutions such as that. But I mean, that's got to be the kind of area that I think Ed Miliband has to be looking at, because if he continues, I think, to make his case based on transition and the importance of tackling climate change, as he does very, very effectively, but within government, I think he's going to find a harder and harder audience, and that's going to fall on deaf ears. And he's got to start talking about cost and affordability quite quickly. We already know he nearly got moved as Energy Secretary in the last reshuffle, so I suspect Desmond would be wise to start thinking along those kinds of lines.
Well, he did make a commitment. Well, the government made a commitment about a certain amount of money coming off your energy bills within a certain period of time.
£300.
Yeah.
£300, which they don't like to talk about anymore.
No.
But and here you go. Here's another bit of insider intel. I'm told that whenever Desna's advisors go to Number 10 to discuss their latest idea, on, let's say, offshore wind or onshore wind or small modular reactors, they get blank faces, and then the question comes back right to the end, and how's that going to take £300 off people's bills? So I think there are parts of the system that are very, key to do that. I think it needs to filter down to Desmond's as well.
Yeah.
Rachel, so just I suppose just tying together a few questions, particularly on vulnerable customers, low-income customers, around the social tariff and building trust for them. Are there certain things that you think can really help that audience?
Well, one thing I was just thinking about is we did an evaluation of the domestic energy affordability scheme. So this was basically EPG and then the £400 that everybody got on their bills. And I was actually leading the work on Northern Ireland, which is very different to here because everybody, well, a large proportion of people use oil. And it's a completely different energy market, so actually it's not really comparable at all. But they do have an energy charter there around debt, particularly related to things like people on prepayment meters and the level of energy debt in Northern Ireland, considering the prices of energy there, was interestingly, you know, it's not what you would expect it to be because they have this charter in place and because there is a lot of, but it's not such a competitive market, so it's not easily comparable. But there is that charter, so I think that aspect of it. I think the other thing with I think in terms of the whole confidence point, there's something about heat pumps, other low carbon heating solutions becoming normalised, becoming the thing that people do. We're actually doing some work with BAFTA Alba on the broadcasting side about making climate content on TV. I don't know if anybody saw the heat pump in the wool pack on Emmerdale, which created quite a lot of discussion. But some of it's about, you know, actually getting things into the, you know, things becoming normal, and I think they're still not normal. They're still an exceptional thing. So, and again, I think it's just the trusted advisors. I think it is people like housing associations giving the messages, Centre for Sustainable Energy, who do support people and send them to the Ombudsman and other charities. But yeah, I think it's really about those trusted messengers and maybe case studies as well, examples of where they've been effective and people actually telling each other about where they've worked.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for people watching wherever you are on a beach somewhere. Just to say that we're going to have sort of 10, 15 minutes or so of networking. So if you want to stay, speak amongst yourselves, plug your ideas to the speakers, you can do. A final thank you for the kind of intellectual financial partnership between Energy Ombudsman and Brightblue. It's been long-standing, and we're very grateful for it, and it's been very effective. And if you're interested in energy policy, please come to an event that we're doing with EDF, 2 p.m. today, which is Can Homegrown Electricity Deliver Clean, Secure and Affordable Energy for the UK? So please do come along to that. And if we could have a round of applause for our speakers, that would be great. Thank you.